What's good, everybody? It's your boy Big Nate. Welcome back to Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews. And today we have a dope ass video. Today we are reviewing The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, a book full of the philosophy of art and decadence. It has amazing characters, the premise of the story, fire, the writing itself fantastic. What more could you want from a book than this? So I'm very excited to talk about this. But of course, this is Big Nate's Book Reviews, so you guys already know what to do. What's this? It looks like it's a doobie. I guess we have got to spark that. So if you're Big Nate gang, you already know what to do. Today we are smoking this one for Oscar Wilde. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, so this book was published in 1890, making Oscar Wilde a certified old head. It is his first and only novel that he ever wrote. Bro came onto the novel scene, dropped this banger, and then dipped. He's famous for several other plays, many of which I actually read throughout my degree, but this is a truly unique piece of art in my opinion. And I wanted to give a little bit of background lore because it was actually inspired by a real event that took place with Oscar Wilde. So what happened was he was sitting for a portrait, right? One of his friends was doing a portrait of him, and once he sees it, he has this thought, because it's beautiful, right? The portrait's fantastic, and he thinks to himself, how tragic it is that I shall have to grow old while this portrait gets to remain forever young. If only it were the other way around. If only it were I who could remain forever young, and the portrait which was to grow old. So this is a real event that happened with Oscar Wilde when he saw his own portrait, and so you can keep that in mind when we discuss the fact that that is essentially the story of Dorian Gray. Because in the beginning of the book, there's a man named Basil who is doing a portrait of the titular character, Dorian Gray, who is like in the prime of his youth. He's like this young man, and Basil has been very inspired by him artistically. In many ways, he's like this ideal symbol, this muse, and we'll get into that. But so he's doing a portrait of Dorian, and then we also very quickly meet the third main character of this book, who is Lord Henry, who has to be probably, at least of like, you know, the kind of side characters, has to be one of my favorite in all of fiction. And the beginning of the book starts with all of them kind of interacting, and it's actually all kicked off by a conversation between Lord Henry and Dorian, who are meeting for the first time. And Lord Henry basically hits Dorian with an existential crisis, hits him with the cold water, and forces him to realize something I think all of us have also realized at some point in our lives, and it's just that we will one day grow old, right? We will become wrinkled, our bodies will fail us, we will lose all the beauties of youth, right? A flower is at its most beautiful when it's blooming, not when it's wilting. And Dorian right now is absolutely in the bloom of his youth. The book describes him as literally one of those mortals whom the Greek gods would have fought over. But as Lord Henry points out, what the gods give, they are quick to take away. And so he's telling Dorian, you know, you really only have a few years of your life in which you can really fully, perfectly live your life. Every month past that, as it wanes, brings you closer to something dreadful. The pulse of joy that beats in us at 20 becomes sluggish. Our senses fail, our limbs rot, we degenerate into hideous puppets haunted by the passions of youth. And finally he asks Dorian, he says, now wherever you go, you charm the world, but will it always be so? And this hits Dorian like a ton of bricks, so that when he finally sees the portrait that Basil has painted, and it's beautiful, it's his masterpiece, it's truly a work of art. So when Basil finally shows him the painting, he has the same reaction that Oscar Wilde had in real life, where he sees it and he thinks to himself, or he says out loud, how tragic it is that I shall grow old and the portrait shall always stay young. If only it were the other way around. If only I stayed young and the portrait grew old. And then this is the critical part. He says, for that I would give anything. Yes, I would even give my own soul. And essentially Dorian gets exactly what he wishes. He gets to remain throughout the novel forever young, and the portrait resembles not only his aging, but I think because he gives his soul, it becomes a representation also of his conscience. And there's a point where Basil says, sin is a thing a man wears upon its face. But because Dorian made that exchange and he gets to remain forever young and this perfect symbol of what he was at that time, it's rather the portrait who wears Dorian's sins upon its face. And as we see throughout the novel, in perfect proportion to Dorian's level of moral corruption, this portrait, which was once so beautiful, turned into something that is just hideous to behold. Even Dorian himself is horrified to look at the thing. There's a great line in the book that says, what the worms were to the corpse, so too would Dorian's sins be to the canvas. They would mar its beauty and eat away its grace. And as another line says, the leprosies of Dorian's sin would slowly eat the thing away. And at first, Dorian doesn't particularly seem to mind. He just is of the opinion, you know, who needs a conscience anyway? He can just put the portrait upstairs, cover it with a curtain, right? Sweep it under the rug of his mind and just go about doing his decadent, selfish things. But as the novel progresses, and I think it's very much like psychoanalytic, like in terms of ideas from like Freud and Jung, these have perfect application to this book, where throughout the novel, all of that stuff that he's repressing starts to come out in very interesting ways psychologically, such that by the end of the book, he's just in a really miserable state. And as Lord Henry says, what does it profit a man if he gained the whole world and lose his own soul? So that right there is pretty much like the story at like the plot of the picture of Dorian Gray, but as much as anything. So I liken this book to things like East of Eden or Anna Karenina, or even something like Lonesome Dove, where the characters and the dialogue are so much of what makes this book fantastic, and also the philosophy. This is absolutely a piece of philosophical fiction. But so I had to talk about some of the characters. The first one I want to talk about is Basil, the man who paints the portrait of Dorian Gray. And to me, my interpretation of the text is that it's actually Basil who infused the portrait with its sort of like magical properties, because Basil has this whole philosophy where he says any portrait that is painted with feeling is actually a portrait of the artist, not the sitter. The sitter is merely the accident, the occasion. It is not he, but rather the painter who upon the colored canvas reveals himself. And that's why Basil, even though he just painted this absolutely brilliant portrait of Dorian that even Lord Henry, who be yapping a lot, is like, wow, this shit's fantastic, he refuses to exhibit it because he has put too much of himself into it. And I think it's exactly that, putting himself into it, that when Dorian, who is also having this existential crisis movement of the soul with his conversation with Lord Henry, those two meet, Dorian wishes upon the star and he gets his bargain. I think Basil is an interesting character too, because throughout the novel he has to watch what was like really like his transcendent artistic ideal muse, like the symbol he held highest. He has to watch as Dorian becomes morally corrupt and turns into the complete opposite of the thing that had inspired him in the first place. And you know, there's a really touching line. It's very subtle, but at one point when Dorian's starting to show these sort of moral changes, basically become more of a dickhead, him and Lord Henry are about to go to the opera and they invite Basil. But Basil bites his lip, walks over to the painting and says sadly, "I shall stay with the real Dorian." And the question of who is the real Dorian is something that's visited throughout this text, because even once Basil hears what Dorian says about "I would give my soul," he's like, if that's how you feel, I'm going to destroy this thing right now. And even Dorian himself says no, that to do so would be murder. And then the portrait represents his conscience, his soul, like that essential part of him, and yet there's the external body, which again is still so beautiful. And there's a line that when he walks into a bar, men who had been talking grossly become silent because there is something in the purity and the innocence of his face that rebuked them and reminded them of the innocence that they too had once tarnished. So there's like this duality between the portrait and Dorian, you know, who is the real Dorian. But anyway, I also wanted to talk about Lord Henry, who, as I alluded to, is just an absolute amazing character. And it's just because he is just such a deeply insightful person, and yet the whole time he's funny, sarcastic, witty. Bro always has something to say. Anytime Lord Henry popped up on the page, I knew I was in for a treat. But it's ultimately him who is the sort of serpent in the garden for Dorian, because he's the one who gets him to have that existential crisis, and in that sort of impulsive moment, which of course comes with youth, he wishes upon the portrait. But also throughout the novel, Lord Henry is constantly encouraging Dorian to embrace a decadent lifestyle, and we'll talk about that later, but it's like trying all these new experiences and pleasures and living for oneself. There's no such thing as morality, it's all beauty, it's all pleasure, you know, stuff like that. So, and the two of them are very much alike in that respect, but the difference is that Lord Henry is a fundamentally good person. So as Basil says, and Basil and Lord Henry, they're the ones who are the OG homies in the beginning of the book. That's how it starts. Basil says, "You are thoroughly ashamed of your own virtues. You never say a moral thing, and yet you never do a wrong thing. Your cynicism is simply opposed." So at the end of the day, Lord Henry does embrace this like philosophical, decadent lifestyle, but he's fundamentally a good person, whereas Dorian fundamentally is not. There's also some just great lines that come from Lord Henry. So for instance, he has a banger. He says, "To get back my youth, I would do anything in the world except wake up early, take exercise, and be respectable." So, you know, I feel him on that. He also says, "Even the cardinal virtues cannot atone for the sin of half-cold entrees," which is what I'm busting out next time. If server brings me some not hot enough, I'm gonna have to go Lord Henry on their ass. I said, even the cardinal virtues. Get that? I'm sending it back. And so just to talk a little more about Dorian, he is someone who, at least for a large part of the book, does get to embrace, he gets something out of the deal essentially. He gets to remain forever young, forever beautiful, and he is embracing this lifestyle where he is having a fullness of experience, trying all sorts of new sensations. And by switching roles with the portrait, Dorian's life essentially becomes a work of art. And there's even a line in the book that says, "Every once in a while, life produces one of its own masterpieces, just as painting or sculpture or poetry has its own masterpieces." It creates a personality whose life and experiences is just as Lord Lord Henry would say, a work of art. But ultimately this turns sour as the novel goes on because Dorian becomes more and more corrupt, and it's almost like he has this Midas touch. There's a rumor that it takes no more for Dorian to enter a house than for some kind of shame to follow after. And it's just everyone who he is associated with ends up committing suicide or becomes addicted to opium, or their lives are otherwise ruined in some way, and Dorian just doesn't seem to have a care in the world until, of course, certain things start happening within him psychologically and with the portrait, but we will leave those for readers to find out. We have to talk about the philosophy that is in this book, because throughout the entire story, Oscar Wilde is putting forth, and again, through a lot of times through the characters themselves, but he puts forth a whole philosophy of art and decadence, which I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about, because one of the ideas that I loved from this novel is the idea that art is irrational, in the sense that it's literally outside of reason. Like when I see a beautiful painting, or even like a scene of nature, but when I'm walking through a museum and a painting catches my eye in that moment, when I look at it, when I take it all in, it is beautiful in that immediate instant, right? Like I don't need to come up with reasons why this painting is beautiful. It is already immediately true. And you can use reason to kind of articulate why after the fact, or even use it for interpretation. But as Lord Henry says, beauty, real beauty, ends where intellectual expression begins. Beauty is just on an entirely different order than something like reason. And he says beauty is a form of genius, and is in fact higher than genius because it needs no explanation. It is of the great facts of this world, like sunlight or springtime. It cannot be questioned. So it's just like this fundamental, irreducible property really of the universe, which, like I just said, is separate and distinct from reason, which is related to the whole premise of this story, right? Art in this book, and I think that Oscar Wilde is arguing it at a larger point, is genuinely supernatural. So obviously with the exchange that takes place, the Faustian bargain with Dorian and the portrait, but he also has this line, he's just like, look at this, right? This is just ink on a page. And when you see a painting, it's just color upon a canvas. And yet he says there is this subtle affinity between the chemical atoms which arrange themselves, for instance, on a painting in shape and form and color. There is an affinity between those chemical atoms and the soul that is within each and every one of us. When a piece of art changes your life, that is in some way a magical event. So I love that. And then just even less abstract, he says, when you see a beautiful sunset, or you get a whiff of perfume that brings back old memories, or you remember a cadence of music, Lord Henry says, I tell you, Dorian, it is upon these things that our lives depend. So just the idea that beauty, the little everyday beauties of life, are what give our life real meaning. And this is part and parcel with Lord Henry's philosophy of decadence, which really embraces things like pleasures and sensations and having this fullness of experience, which things like Stoicism or Buddhism or the early Greek philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, they all say that the senses are things to be reined in, right? They need to be disciplined, essentially beat into submission by the higher order divine reasoning mind. But an idea put forth in this book is, what if we could rather integrate all those senses into a larger new spirituality, of which a fine instinct for beauty would be the prominent characteristic. There is a spiritualizing of the senses, and as Lord Henry says, there is no cure for the soul but the senses, and no cure for the senses but the soul. And at some point, Dorian is reading a book that, of course, Lord Henry lent to him, and he says at times he could not tell whether he was reading the spiritual ecstasies of a medieval saint or whether he was reading the morbid confessions of a modern sinner. So there is this, you know, the Jungian idea of an enantiodrome. I never know how to say that. An enantiodromia. When you take one thing to the furthest limit, it ends up sort of reversing into the opposite of itself, such that the senses, no less than the soul, have their own mysteries to reveal. So tons of great stuff to talk about in this book. I feel like I'm still just kind of scratching the surface, and that's the thing. It's short. The writing is fantastic. Characters amazing. This is a book that I think if you've been trying to make the plunge into like real classic literature, I think this would be a great place to start. The official Big Nate grade is going to be an A+. The lowest I'd go in A, and that's on the classic scale. And you know, there's a couple scenes in this book that I can like think of that drag for a little bit, but you know, it's absolutely worth it. If you have read The Picture of Dorian Gray, or if you've read anything else by Oscar Wilde, or any ideas that came up from this discussion, you guys already know what to do. Let me know in the comments. In the meantime, get to the Big Nate Discord. Follow me on Instagram, Big Nate's Book Reviews. I got the second channel, the Big Nate Review. We also just did our first official stream of the Big Nate Reading Club on Twitch, and it was a fire discussion. So get to all the links in the bio. In the meantime, thank you for watching Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews.